Thanks. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming. What's that? Small group. That's okay. I'm happy with it. Yes, you are. So I want to tell you a little bit about this book because I'm sure you have no clue who I am or what I'm doing here today, beyond the fact that Leslie asked you to come, which I think was very nice of him. Thanks for bringing your students, and thank you for coming. This is a book that I spent about 8 years on. It was a long 8 years where I was rarely sure where I was going. But the reason I'm telling you this is because that's often the way it is for a writer, when you feel like you've got something to say but you really have no clue what it is. That's kind of a scary and weird place to be sometimes. But the important thing is to show up every day anyway, get your butt in the seat and spend at least a little bit of time every day pounding it out. And there's lessons here you can apply to any discipline. It doesn't matter if you're interested in writing or something else. If you keep showing up, you know, I think we were talking about Woody Allen earlier. I think Woody Allen said showing up is 85% of life, or maybe it was John Lennon, I don't know. Anyway, it's true. All you got to do most of the time is just show up, and that's when the good stuff happens. So, this book was published in Canada by Thomas Allen Publishers, who got bought later by Dundurn. It won the Riddall Award last year, which is one of Canada's more prestigious awards, and it's definitely the most prestigious award in Atlantic Canada. It's the Thomas H. Riddall Atlantic Fiction Award. It was a big honor for me to win this award because Thomas Riddall was such a well-known author, and his family is very committed to perpetuating his legacy, and they've boosted the award financially over the years, which as a writer I really appreciate. His son is not a writer, but he's in charge of the award now. His son is a dentist, which I find very interesting, but he's really still very committed to the literary arts. So this is a book about a young veteran of Afghanistan. He is American because I'm American, but he could easily be Canadian. His nationality really doesn't matter. He's 25 years old, I think, when the book starts, so a little older than you, but when he came home from Afghanistan, he was just your age. And he had been very badly wounded. So he spent the last 5 years trying to recover and to fully come home. And he's working as a teacher in a small high school in a tiny little town in the desert of California, the Mojave Desert. So I'm just going to start kind of in the middle. This book has some language in it. If you're offended by that, I'm sorry. His name is Jeremy, by the way. An hour later, he's rolling an Al Saturn through the mean streets of Elysium, smelling the powdery dust and the acrid tang of creosote bushes through the air vents. It's only 7:10 a.m., but already he must turn the air conditioning on if he's to tolerate sitting in the car. Heat like this makes a person take things minute by minute. At this rate, it's going to be a hell of a long day. An endless series of minutes stretching to the horizon, each one filled with pain and anxiety and frustration and heat, punctuated only by a government-subsidized cafeteria lunch, then the prospect of lying in bed and staring at the ceiling for a few hours before falling asleep again. In between, teenagers, a crowd of people looking at him all big-eyed. Someone will undoubtedly call him a hero, thank him for his service, pump his hand, grow misty, ask more stupid questions, tell him they want their kids to grow up to be like him. Fuck them all. Thank you for your service is something you say to a waiter. To a soldier, you don't say anything, because unless you were there with him, there's really nothing you can say. And if you were there with him, that's probably the last thing you'd want to talk about. Suddenly, Jeremy realizes that he would very much like to get out of this ceremony. But how? He has no options, really. He's to be one of the guests of honor. This is blatantly unfair. You should have a choice about these things. Maybe a fake injury is the way to go. He's sorely tempted to swing the nose of the car into the wall of the Cozy Cart, the Lebanese-owned convenience store he happens to be passing at that moment. Not hard enough to hurt himself, maybe just so he can spend the morning in the emergency room getting checked out. But if he went to the ER, he would have to see other people who were sick or hurt. That might bring on another panic attack. And he might hurt someone else, such as Khazar, the lonely guy from Beirut who was always on duty behind the cash register, or his grandmother with whom he lives. And hurting people is something he's promised himself he's never going to do again. Then he says to himself, "You shouldn't have pushed Jen." "But she was trying to kiss me." Think about that for a minute, you fuck. A kiss. What's a kiss? Something nice. And you gave her back something shitty. "Yeah, but I'm a teacher and she's a student." Who gives a fuck? Babies are dead and limbs are blown off and entire villages are laid waste and your panties are in a twist because some girl tried to kiss you? I'm a fuck up. Yeah, you're a fuck up. After he arrives in the parking lot, it takes him a few minutes to work up the breath to swing his legs out of the car. He heads through the doors of the place that by the end of the day will officially be named Thomas Sardi Memorial High School and checks his mailbox. There's another handwritten note. You'd think people had never heard of email. "Come see me first thing so we can talk about today. Peter Porteous." He files this in the trash can. No one else is here yet except Jesus, the custodian, whose wheeled bin he can hear rolling along somewhere on the open campus, echoing from the 60s-era brick walls with a sound remarkably like that of mechanized armor. He heads out the back door of the building and into the quad, outside again. There are few hallways in a desert high school. Everything is open to the sky so that the students' minds may know no limits. Jeremy attended high school here, and every time he unlocks his classroom, he has the sense that either his childhood was a bad dream or his adulthood is, but he can't tell which. The nostalgia the so-called friends on his Facebook list seem to feel for those days is a complete puzzlement. High school for him was neither a bad time nor a good one. It was just a time, a stretch he did, a sentence he finished to the satisfaction of his jailers. In comparison with what had come after, it had faded quickly into insignificance. Now, as he steps into the same room he once entered as a student for lessons that scarcely sunk in, he wonders yet again at the timelessness of buildings and rooms, how one moment he passes over the grimy linoleum in his Converse All-Stars, his head full of thoughts that seem fluffy and inconsequential now, even though he can't remember what they were, and the next moment he treads upon them in his admittedly shoddy but still far more adult loafers. 7 or more years behind him, his burden made heavier by the knowledge that 7 years hence, the contents of his mind in this moment will seem just as ridiculous. And there is nothing timeless about buildings at all. They are as temporary as anything else, destructible and flammable, although by tacit agreement everyone seems to concur that it would be better not to think or talk about such things. Someday this building will be gone, and everyone in it will be long dead, and none of it will matter in the slightest. There is only this moment in which he sets his steaming mug on the black stone of the demonstration table, in which he picks up the dry erase marker from the tray, in which he uncaps it with a pop like a bottle of champagne and begins to write. He writes the date on the board, followed by the half-assed lesson plan he came up with in his head on the way over here. Jeremy's knowledge of physics is largely limited to the principle of what goes up must come down. His nights for the past month have consisted of lots of internet cramming sessions. In addition to everything else that's wrong with him, he's also developed an advanced case of imposter syndrome. At any moment, he expects a tap on the shoulder from someone informing him that there's been a terrible mistake, that he actually has no business in a classroom. And if he leaves quietly, right away, they're willing to just pretend the whole thing never happened. Which would, he thinks, be a vast relief, almost as sweet as waking up last night and finding himself at home, and not back in the old schoolhouse they'd used as their post. Imagine that. Soldiers stationed right here in paradise, shitting into blast holes in the linoleum floor, sleeping in corners of classrooms, the windows taped up and boarded over, Porteous's office turned into a command base, a 50 cal set up on the roof behind a pile of sandbags. These things happen in other parts of the world. They can happen here too. He would like to make people aware of this somehow, but no one will believe him. Among the American people, or at least the American people he knows, there is a tacit belief that shit happens to people in other parts of the world simply because they did not have the good fortune to be born in America. That people who live in mud houses and ride donkeys and wear long dresses, even if they're men, are somehow not real people. He'd once believed this himself, but now he knows it not to be true. War had once been just as inconceivable to the people of Afghanistan as it is now to the people of Elysium. This is one of the things he knows best, but the things he knows best are things that no one else wants to hear. They're doing a unit on force equals mass times acceleration, so he tries to think of some examples. That's easy. A .50 caliber round slams into a human body with a force that is equal to its mass of 94.99 grams, multiplied by its incredible velocity of about 3,000 feet per second, which is too hard to do in his head, but is certainly enough to separate a head from a neck, or a lower torso from an upper torso, or a mother from a child. He closes his eyes until that one goes away. There are images like that one which he does not consider to be actual memories. Real memories live and breathe and even have motion and emotion as if they were actually made of cells rather than flashes of electricity. But this image, the sight of a dead mother clutching a dead child, exists instead in some kind of frozen state. It flicks on at odd moments like a spotlight that holds him in its steady eye, daring him to gaze directly at it. He doesn't know who shot that woman. Maybe it was him. It was surely a mistake. He'd come upon her after a bad fight, just as the baby was breathing its last. The mother was already dead. The top of her dress had been torn away by the force of the round, and he had seen her breast, long and floppy and gray, drops of milk still beating on the nipple, and he had screamed for the medic, but his voice made no sound. It just came out as a rush of forced air. No, 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 no. No, no, not today, please, not today. It's possible that he stands there for several minutes, arm upraised, the dry erase marker poised in his hand. He doesn't know. He tends to lose time, like those people who say they've been abducted by aliens. At least these episodes seem to occur only when he's alone, when he has nothing to distract him from his own thoughts. He wonders if he looks like Henry does during those petit mal seizures he used to get, when he simply stared off into space as if he was listening to some secret voice. If this were to happen during class, the students could ping spitballs off his forehead and he'd never notice. But when he hears other people coming into the building, he snaps out of it. He grabs his mug and locks his classroom door. Then he heads back to the admin building for another cup of joe and to see what the principal wants. I think I'm going to skip ahead a little bit now. And I'm going to read from the point of view of a different character. That's Jeremy's grandfather. So Jeremy is a veteran of Afghanistan. His grandfather is a veteran of Vietnam. And the two of them live in the same house. And the tension that sort of arises between them is the source of the conflict that drives much of the book. So I wanted you to kind of meet his character too. He's become kind of infamous because he's very crotchety and sometimes politically incorrect. So that's Al. The title of his book, I'll just tell you real quickly, comes from the fact that Jeremy's grandmother makes hearts out of wood, or she did. She dies at the beginning of the book. But what she does is she makes these little wooden hearts and she kind of decorates them with glitter and ribbon and stuff like that, and she sells them at craft fairs. So she's passed away, and Al has these boxes of hearts, and he doesn't know what to do with them. So that's the other thing that kind of drives the story. What is Al going to do with these hearts? If Jeremy were here, he's decided he's going to sell them on eBay. And if Al were feeling up to braving his eye-rolling size, he could ask him just how this eBay thing works. He's perused the site himself many a time, fascinated by the sheer variety of items for sale, but he's never actually bought anything, not daring to trust his credit card to cyberspace, which according to Time magazine is populated with perverts and con men, and he's certainly never sold anything either. Yet he knows that one must take a picture of the thing one wishes to sell and put it on the site somehow so people can see what they're buying. So the first thing he must do is photograph the hearts. This is how you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. He carts every shoebox of hearts he can find into the garage, where he removes them one by one and lays them out on newspapers. He separates them first according to whether or not they are finished. Those that had not yet been painted or adorned with scrolls go back into a box. The rest, exactly 100 of them, lie twinkling on the floor. In recent months, Helen, undergoing another artistic metamorphosis, had begun using a new kind of paint. It has sparkles in it, or glitter, or ground up fairy shit or some damn thing, and now the hearts catch the light and shine in a way that Al finds tawdry, but which had delighted her. There's a digital camera somewhere in the house, but that belongs to Rita, and he dares not touch it. Instead, he goes for the Sony he'd bought to demonstrate to Helen once and for all that she snored. An antique now, so large that he must hoist it onto one's shoulder. Maybe Jeremy knows a way to put videos on eBay. He'd intended to use this camera often, but once he'd made his case to Helen with video evidence, it had sat untouched. This made it a rare extravagance. The category of equipment was a sacred one, encompassing everything from the smallest screwdriver to the Saturn, perhaps even the house itself. And one of the key tenets of equipment was that it must be used often enough to justify its purchase. He'd planned on videotaping Jeremy's future star performances on the football team, but to his eternal disappointment, Jeremy had turned out to disdain football. He only wanted to play video games with that fat little Mexican. He could have videotaped Henry, he supposed, but who wanted to watch movies of a retarded kid? That would just be depressing. Never once did he look at Henry without imagining how he might have turned out if that cord hadn't been wrapped around his neck. Besides, Rita was the photographer of the family. At least he'd packed the Sony away properly in its original box and molded styrofoam bed. The top of the box was dusty, but that was the only way in which time had ravaged it. Inside the camera, Al finds the original video cassette he'd used to record Helen over 2 decades ago. He knows her snoring will not still be on it. Mortified, she'd forced him to erase it, he remembers. He wishes now he hadn't. He would pay good money to hear her snore one more time. He plugs the camera in and is gratified to hear it whir into life. After a full minute of struggle, he deduces how to make the thing record. He points it at the hearts and pans over them. Suddenly it occurs to him that he ought to provide some narration, for he wants people to really understand what they're looking at. He clears his throat and begins. This is Alvin Merkin speaking. The date is September 5, 2011, and I'm standing in my garage in my house on Jacaranda Street in Elysium, California, USA. We've resided here since 1988. I retired from the Edmonston pumping plant in 2002, where I worked for 33 years, mostly as a supervisor. How much should he say about himself? As little as possible, he decides. The people viewing this on the internet are not buying him, after all. Nevertheless, he feels they might appreciate some context, so he swivels the camera to look down the driveway, treating them to a view of the front yard and the house across the street. People are always interested to see what America looks like. There is the home of Mr. Richard Belton, one of our neighbors, he says. Mr. Belton is employed by the state of California. He commutes to Sacramento 3 times a week. That is an acacia tree in our front yard. I didn't plant it. It was already here when we moved in. As you can see, the weather today is clear, as usual. The temperature is approximately 95 degrees. That's Fahrenheit, he adds, for the benefit of his European viewers. We are not expecting any precipitation today. Enough background. He returns to the hearts which glitter at him in the slant of sunlight that comes in the open garage door. The items of interest here are several dozen hearts that were manufactured by my late wife, Mrs. Helen Merkin, who passed away last month at the age of 66. Helen and I were married for 47 years. We met when she was still a high school student, and I was a private in the U.S. Army, where I served my country proudly for almost 10 years. Our fathers had done some business together, and that was how we became acquainted. We courted for 2 years and were married in 1964. Helen always enjoyed her crafts even then. It was a hobby, you might say. Even back in those days, she was always making decorations of one sort or another. A memory comes to him and he decides to share it. When I first met her, she used to knit all kinds of doll clothes, little shirts and pants and skirts and whatnot. Quite skilled at it. I'd forgotten all about those. Then she got into picture frames, and after that it was Christmas ornaments. She used to paint them herself and give them away. After that, she went through a scrapbooking phase. We have a whole box of those inside. He debates getting out the scrapbooks to show the camera, but decides against it. He's not even sure what's in them. I would estimate that she commenced making hearts in about 1995, so she had achieved quite a high level of skill. You wouldn't know it to look at them, but each one of these things takes quite a bit of work. I would say that she spent at least half an hour on each one. The hearts are made of high-quality balsa wood, which I procured at our local hardware store and cut out for her on my jigsaw. Al swings the camera around to show the jigsaw in question. No doubt he thinks his male viewers will enjoy seeing it. I utilize a Black & Decker. It gives a good cut. I've maintained it well, of course, as I do all my equipment. I replace the blades every year. The moving parts are sealed with factory lubrication, so I haven't had to get involved in taking those apart. All in all, I find it was well worth the price, which I believe was around $200 some years ago, if I remember correctly. Back to the hearts. Anyway, these hearts were then painted with a red glittery paint and decorated with hand-lettered scrolls. Helen did all that. She had a pretty steady hand. She was often a vendor at craft sales throughout the region. If you lived in Kern County and you ever went to a craft fair, chances were you saw Helen there at her table. She didn't do it for the money, of course, just for the pure enjoyment of it. If someone wanted a heart but didn't have any money left, she would just give them one, especially at the end of the day when she was packing up. She was happy to see them find a home, that's all. They do brighten up a place. Why, you ought to see the inside of our house. Hearts everywhere. You can hang them on your walls. You can even hang them on your Christmas tree. Some people have even put them on their front doors. Others display them in the living room. They're a very versatile item. The price is $3.50 each. But, he says in a flash of entrepreneurial inspiration, if someone was interested in purchasing the entire lot, I would be willing to arrange a discount. That's all he needs to say, he supposes, but it still feels incomplete somehow. He clears his throat and goes on, still aiming the camera at the hearts. Helen was quite a woman. She put all her time and energy into her crafts when she wasn't taking care of Henry. That's our grandson, who was born mentally retarded. You may not know it, but it actually takes a lot of talent to make these hearts. I guess they were sort of a reflection of the way Helen felt about the world. Al pauses. He feels himself growing flushed in the face, and he presses on to distract himself. She was good with her hands that way, always had a lot of patience for fine detail. She also enjoyed baking quite a bit. She made cookies, cakes, and pies, and whenever possible, she tried to use fresh fruit in season. It's easy for us to obtain a lot of fresh produce here in California. I would have to say, he goes on, unsure now but forging ahead, that Helen's most outstanding quality was the amount of care she showed in everything she did. And she did everything for her family. She didn't think about herself very much. If she had spare time on her hands, which wasn't often, she would always try to use it to make the house look a little nicer or to do something for one of the grandkids. We have another grandson, Jeremy, who's 25 this year. He also served in the Army. He was wounded quite badly in Afghanistan, but I'm happy to report that he's made a good recovery so far. I remember the day we found out he'd been hurt. Al checks himself here, for a catch has appeared in his throat. He disguises it as a cough. Helen was just beside herself. She didn't eat, didn't sleep. She just sat by the phone for days and days. You couldn't get her to take so much as a sip of water. Al, she said, I just don't know what we'd do if we lost that boy. Those were her exact words. We raised Jeremy too, you see, because he has no father to speak of. and his mother was working a lot. When Helen wasn't waiting by the phone, she was praying in her bedroom. I'm not a religious man myself, but one of the great things about this country is our freedom of religion. You can decide for yourself whether you want to get involved in that or not. No one is holding a goddamn gun to your head. Anyway, he goes on, Helen passed away, as I say, just over a month ago. The date was August 3rd, 2011. She died in her sleep with no warning. I was the one who... This time there's no coughing his way through it. Al hiccups, tries to catch his breath, and decides finally that enough is enough. He looks frantically for the off button on the camera, but when he can't find it, he yanks the cord from the outlet, violating his own long-standing rule by failing to use a proper grip on the plug. Then he removes the cassette and packs the Sony away in its box again. He watches it on the VCR in the living room, embarrassed and yet proud somehow. He's appalled at the way his hand shakes, at how his world is reduced to grainy footage and washed out color, but he thinks that Helen would have enjoyed his testimonial. He hadn't intended it to be that kind of thing, but now that it's turned out that way, he feels pleased. Maybe Jeremy will know how to cut out the irrelevant segments. He doesn't want his customers to feel like they're dealing with an emotional fool. That kind of messiness does not inspire confidence in one's business dealings. The next step is to figure out how to get this onto the computer somehow. For this, he'll definitely need Jeremy's help. Al doesn't pretend to understand computers. They have no moving parts, for one thing, and for another, he's embarrassed to admit that he never believed they would become even slightly useful. He's amazed at how everything these days is computers this and computers that. In Time magazine, he'd read that the average teenager carries more technology in his pocket than there was in the command module of the first moon lander. And still all they do is take drugs and have sex. America, he thinks, is wasted on the wrong people. But he does know how to surf the internet, and suddenly an idea occurs to him. You can find out just about anything these days, and there is no need for him to rack his brain any longer. He opens up a browser window and navigates his way to Google, where he types in how to put video from a Sony camera circa 1991 onto the computer fairly easily. The results are disappointing. They don't make much sense. It's rare that the internet lets him down. Maybe his search terms need to be refined. But he's weary suddenly. He will turn the damn thing off, maybe take a nap or something. Then another idea occurs to him. If you can look up things about video cameras, maybe he can solve another problem. He opens a new page on Google and types in ways to commit suicide. I'll stop there. Thanks very much for coming tonight, guys.